A fist hammered against a locked car window, then again harder until the glass spiderwebbed. A woman crouched behind that car in a white dress, both hands pressed over her mouth so no one would hear her breathing. Gravel crunched, boots. A man's voice called a name that wasn't hers to keep. She squeezed her eyes shut and prayed the footsteps would pass. They didn't. A shadow fell across the dirt and a hand reached down toward her bare shoulder. She flinched so hard she nearly screamed. But the hand stopped. It belonged to a stranger with a gray beard and road dust on his leather, a wolf dog standing silent at his heel. He put one finger to his lips. That stranger was Deacon Cade, and he hadn't spoken a single word to a woman in 10 years. Why did he break that silence for her? So stay with me. He didn't say anything. He just held that finger to his lips and waited, and she did the smart thing. She stayed still. She stayed quiet. The boots moved off toward the front of the chapel, and the man calling her name gave up and went inside. Now let me back this up. You need to understand who this stranger was before you understand why what happened next mattered. His name was Deacon Cade. Some of the older folks in that part of Montana still knew the name, and the ones who knew it lowered their voices when they said it. 20 years back, he'd been a road captain for a motorcycle club, not the weekend kind, the real kind. He'd worn the patch that made grown men step off a sidewalk to let him pass. He'd broken bones and had his own broken more times than he could count. And through all of it, there had been one person who kept him human. Her name was Ruth, his wife, the only thing in the world he'd ever been gentle with. Ruth died on a rainy night 10 years before this story, and when she died, something in Deacon shut off like a light. He didn't ride with the club anymore. He didn't drink in the bars. He packed a saddlebag, took his one dog, and rode north into the backcountry until the roads ran out. He built a cabin with his own hands. He hunted. He chopped wood. He grew old and gray and quiet up there alone with nobody to talk to but that wolf dog. The dog's name was Ash. Gray all over, one blue eye, one brown. Half wolf, they said, and you believed it looking at her. Ash didn't bark. She watched. She'd been at his side for 9 of those 10 years. Here's the thing you have to understand. Deacon hadn't spoken to a woman in 10 years. Not one. Not a waitress, not a clerk, not a stranger on a road. Because the last woman he ever spoke to was Ruth, and he'd made himself a kind of promise up in those hills. If he couldn't talk to her, he wouldn't talk to any of them. Grief isn't logical. It was just the rule he lived by. And now, 10 years later, Deacon Cade came down out of the mountains for the first time. Not for anything big. His water pump had cracked. He needed a part, and the nearest place to get one was a town called Ellis Fork, out on the flat where 2 county roads crossed. He rode in slow, Ash trotting beside the Harley, and the whole town seemed to hold its breath as this big gray ghost of a man rumbled past the feed store and the diner. He was thirsty. The dog was thirsty. And on the edge of town he saw a little white chapel with a gravel lot, cars parked all crooked, streamers on the door. A wedding. He figured a church would have a spigot out back, and church people usually didn't turn away a man asking for water, even a man who looked like him. So he pulled in. That's when he heard the crying. It came from behind a parked car at the far edge of the lot. Low, choked, the kind of crying somebody does when they're trying hard not to be heard. And then the man came out of the chapel and started calling. Nora. Nora, where'd you go? Nora, don't do this to me. That man wore a suit that didn't fit right and a badge clipped to his belt, and he was hunting between the cars with the look of a man who owns the thing he's hunting for. Deacon walked over, not to be a hero. He'd have told you that himself. He walked over because a person was hurting, and the sound of it reached down into a part of him that had been asleep a long time. And that's how he ended up crouched in the gravel with his finger to his lips, looking down at a woman in a wedding dress with mascara running down her face and terror in her eyes. Once the boots moved off, she took her hands away from her mouth. She whispered, so quiet he almost missed it. Please. Please don't tell him where I am." Deacon looked at her a long moment, and then he did something that surprised even him. He spoke. His voice came out rough as a gravel road, cracked from a decade of not using it. He said, "Who is he to you?" 3 words. The first 3 words he'd said to a woman in 10 years. And the woman, whose name was Nora Whitfield, had no idea what those 3 words cost him. She told him fast, in a low, panicked rush, glancing at the chapel every few seconds. The man in the suit was Roy Teller, county sheriff, and the man she was supposed to marry in about 8 minutes. She didn't love him. She'd never loved him. But her father had died 4 months back and left behind a mountain of debt, and it turned out Roy Teller held every last note. The farm, the house, all of it. And Teller had made her an offer that wasn't really an offer. Marry me and the debts go away. Say no and I take everything and I put your mama out on the road and I make sure nobody in this county ever gives your family so much as a day's work again. So she'd said yes, because she was cornered. And this morning she'd put on her dead mother's wedding dress, stood in the little bride's room in the back of that chapel, and looked at herself in the mirror, and something in her just said no. Not like this. And she'd climbed out the window and run to the far end of the lot and hidden behind a car like a child, with no plan and nowhere to go, because past the parking lot there was nothing but flat, empty country for 40 miles. She looked up at Deacon and said the truest thing anybody'd said to him in 10 years. She said, "I don't want to be saved. I just don't want to be sold." And something about the way she said it stopped Deacon Cade cold, because he'd heard a voice say something close to that once before, a long time ago on the worst night of his life. He couldn't place it, but it lodged in his chest like a splinter and it wouldn't come out. Inside the chapel, an organ started to play. Now, Roy Teller was not a fool. He'd been sheriff of that county for 11 years, and he'd built himself a little kingdom out of other people's debts. He loaned money to half the failing farms in the valley, and when they couldn't pay, he took their land. The land made him rich, and the badge made him untouchable. Nora's father had been one who couldn't pay, and Nora was the prettiest collateral Teller had ever gotten his hands on. When he came back out of the chapel that second time, he had 2 deputies with him, and he wasn't calling her name gently anymore. He was mad. And this time his eyes landed on the big biker standing between the cars, and on the woman in white just visible behind him. "Well," Teller said, and he smiled the way a man smiles when he thinks he's already won. "There she is." Deacon stepped forward. He put himself, without seeming to, between Teller and the woman. Ash drifted to his side and stood there with her strange 2-colored eyes fixed on the sheriff. And the low sound she made was almost too quiet to hear, but Teller heard it, and Teller's smile flickered. "That's my bride, friend," Teller said. "Wedding's about to start, so you're gonna want to move that dog and move yourself and get back on your bike and ride on out of here. This is town business." Deacon didn't move. He said in that cracked, slow voice, "She doesn't want to marry you." Teller laughed. He actually laughed. "What she wants," he said, "is between her and her creditors, and I'm all of them." He nodded at his deputies. "Get her inside. She's got cold feet, that's all. Happens to every bride." And that was the moment, right there. Because Deacon Cade could have gotten on his bike. He was tired. He was old. He'd come down for a water pump, not a war. Every sensible piece of him said right away, "This isn't yours. You gave up on the world a long time ago." But he looked back at Nora Whitfield, at her mother's dress and her ruined makeup and her chin that she was holding up even though she was shaking. And he thought about Ruth. And he thought about that voice from long ago that he still couldn't place. And he made a decision that changed both their lives. He turned back to Teller and he said, loud enough for the deputies to hear, "She can't marry you," he paused, "because she already agreed to marry me." You could have heard a pin drop in that parking lot. Now understand this was a lie. A big, wild, made-up on-the-spot lie. Deacon had known this woman for about 4 minutes, but it hung in the air, and it was such a strange and enormous thing to say that nobody knew what to do with it. Teller's mouth opened and closed. The deputies looked at each other. And Nora, God bless her, Nora was smart and Nora was desperate, and she saw the only door in a wall of no doors and she walked through it. She stepped up beside Deacon and slid her arm through his and said, in a voice that only shook a little, "It's true, Roy, I'm sorry. I couldn't go through with it because there's already somebody." Teller's face went from white to red. "You don't know this man," he snarled. "You never laid eyes on this saddle tramp before today." And here's where it turned. Because Deacon looked Teller dead in the eye and said something that even he didn't fully understand as it came out of his mouth. He said, "You're wrong about that. We met a long time ago, on a bad night. She just didn't know my name." Nora went very still beside him because the strangest thing had happened. A cold finger of memory had touched the back of her neck. A bad night, a long time ago. She didn't know why, but the words felt true in a way she couldn't explain, and it scared her more than Teller ever had. Teller stood there breathing hard, weighing it. He had a chapel full of guests. He had his reputation, his badge. And a man who runs a county on the appearance of respectability does not want a scene in front of 100 witnesses. Dragging a screaming bride down the aisle by her hair is not a good look, even for a tyrant. He needed her willing or at least quiet. So Teller did the thing that men like him always do. He smiled again and stepped back and said, "All right, you want to play it that way. Come inside, both of you. Let's let the good people of Ellis Fork see this. Let's let them hear the bride tell them, right there at the altar in front of God and everybody, that she'd rather run off with a mountain full of dirt than honor the promise she made. Go on. Let's see you say it in the light." He thought he was calling a bluff. He thought she'd fold in front of the crowd. And he turned and walked back into the chapel, sure of himself, and the organ swelled and the doors stood open, waiting. Deacon looked down at Nora, and in the strangest calm you can imagine, right there in the middle of all that danger, she looked back up at him and did something almost like a laugh, just a broken little breath. "Well," she whispered, "you've done it now." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, took a breath, and set her shoulders. The panic had drained out of her, and something steadier had come in to take its place. She slid her hand into his big, rough hand and said, "Okay, stranger. Walk me in." And Deacon Cade, who had come to town for a water pump, took a woman he'd known for 6 minutes by the hand and walked her toward the doors of a chapel full of the very people who'd come to watch her be sold. Ash padded along at his heel. The music was warm. For one long moment, it felt like the whole thing might just work out easy. It did not. Because as they crossed the threshold, a small woman in the front pew turned to see who was coming up the aisle, and she looked at Deacon's face, and she stood up so fast her purse spilled on the floor, and she said one word out loud in a voice full of pure shock. She said, "You." The organ stopped. Every head in the chapel turned. And the small woman in the front pew, who was Nora's mother, Della Whitfield, stood there staring at Deacon Cade like she'd seen a ghost come up out of the ground. Her hand was over her heart, and she said it again, quieter. "It's you, from the bridge." Now the whole room was confused, and Teller was up at the altar going red again, and Nora turned to her mother and said, "Mama, what are you talking about?" And that's when the truth of this whole thing started to come apart at the seams, right there in front of everybody. Because Della turned to the congregation, to her daughter, and she told a story that most of them had never heard. 10 years back, she said, on a night of terrible rain, she and her husband and her little girl had been driving home over the old Miller's Creek Bridge when their truck slid off the road and went halfway through the guardrail. It hung there over the water, tilting, the doors jammed, the creek rising underneath them, and they were going to die. Nora had been 15. She'd been screaming. Della had been praying. And out of that storm, out of nowhere, a man on a motorcycle had stopped. A big man, a biker. He'd waded down into that flooding creek and braced his own body against the truck to keep it from going over. And he'd torn the jammed door off its hinges with his bare hands. And he'd pulled all three of them out one at a time into the rain. And then, before anyone could even thank him, before anyone got his name, a second set of headlights came, and the man had climbed back on his bike and ridden off into the dark like he was running from something himself. Della had never forgotten his face, not in 10 years, and she was looking at it now. Here's what nobody in that chapel knew, but you should. That rainy night 10 years ago was the night Ruth died. Deacon had been racing to the hospital where his wife lay dying, riding through the worst storm of the decade, half out of his mind. And he'd come over that bridge and seen a family hanging over a flood, and he'd had to choose. Keep riding and maybe reach Ruth in time, or stop. And he'd stopped. He'd saved 3 strangers, and by the time he got back on his road and made it to the hospital, Ruth was already gone. He'd missed her last breath by 20 minutes. He never let himself find out if he'd have made it otherwise. He just carried the not knowing up into the mountains and lived with it for 10 years alone, telling himself he'd traded his wife's last moment for the lives of 3 people whose names he never even learned. And now here they were, all 3, alive, grown. Standing in front of him in a chapel, the little screaming girl from the truck was the runaway bride holding his hand. Deacon's knees nearly went out from under him. That was the connection he'd felt but couldn't place. That was the voice. Because Nora, 15 years old and hanging over a flood, had screamed one thing over and over that night as the water rose. She'd screamed, "I don't want to die like this." And crouched behind a car 10 years later, she'd said something almost the same. "I just don't want to be sold." Same voice, older but the same. His body had recognized it before his mind ever could. The chapel was dead silent now. Nora was staring at him, tears coming again, but different tears. She whispered, "That was you. You're the one who pulled me out of the water. And here's the thing I want you to sit with for a second, because we're at the heart of it now. This man had given up the last minutes of his wife's life to save a stranger. He'd punished himself for it for a decade. And the universe, cruel and strange as it is, had just walked that stranger back into his life and put her hand in his and asked him to save her all over again. If you're still with me here, if this story's got a hold on you, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Stories like this one, true-hearted stories about second chances and the people who show up when it matters, that's all we do on this channel. So subscribe and let's get back to that chapel, because Roy Teller was not about to let a ghost story cost him his bride. Teller came down off that altar step. The kindness was gone from his face now, and so was the patience. He'd seen the room turn. He'd seen 100 faces soften toward the biker and harden against him, and a man like Teller can feel his kingdom shifting under his boots. So he stopped pretending. "Touching," he said. "Real touching, but it doesn't change one thing." He pulled a fold of papers from inside his jacket and held them up over his head so the whole room could see. "These are the notes on the Whitfield farm, signed by her daddy, legal in every court in the state. She doesn't marry me today, I foreclose tomorrow. Her mama's out on the road by Friday." He looked at Nora. "So this stranger can be whoever he wants to be. He can be the hand of God himself, but he can't pay what you owe. Can he?" And the room went quiet again, because that was the trap, and everybody could see it. It didn't matter what Deacon had done 10 years ago. It didn't matter who loved who. Teller held the paper, and the paper held the family, and that was that. Nora's shoulders started to drop. The steadiness went out of her, because he was right and she knew it, and she started to let go of Deacon's hand, started to say the words that would give herself up to save her mother. "It's okay," she breathed. "I'll do it. Mama, it's okay." But Deacon didn't let go of her hand. He tightened his grip, and he said one word. "How much?" Teller blinked. "What?" "The debt," Deacon said. "How much?" Teller named a number then, a big ugly number, and he said it like a wall, like a thing that could not be climbed. He said it and he smiled, because who was this backcountry hermit in road-worn leather to talk about a number like that? And Deacon Cade reached into the inside of his own jacket, slow, and he pulled out a folded envelope, thick and soft with age, and he held it a second before he opened it. Because here's the last thing nobody knew. When Ruth died, she'd left him everything, and Ruth had not been a poor woman. Her family had owned land and sold it, and there'd been an inheritance and a life insurance policy on top of it, and all of it had come to Deacon on the worst day of his life. He'd never touched a dime. 10 years in a cabin he built with his own hands, hunting his own meat, and the whole time there'd been a small fortune sitting in a bank in Ruth's name and his. He'd never wanted it. It was blood money to him, money that came from her being gone. He'd carried the account papers in that envelope for 10 years, close to his heart, the way you carry a photograph of someone you can't put down. He opened the envelope. He looked at Teller, and he said, "Whatever she owes, I'll pay it, today, all of it. And I'll give you one more thing on top." He stepped closer, and his voice dropped low, but the chapel was so quiet everyone heard it anyway. "I'll give you until sundown to be gone out of this valley, because I know men like you. I ran with worse than you for 20 years, and I know exactly what a badge is worth when the people who gave it to you find out what you've been doing with it." He turned to the congregation then, to the farmers and the shopkeepers and the ranch hands, the whole valley Teller had been squeezing for 11 years. "How many of you," Deacon said, "owe this man money? How many of you signed his papers when your crop failed? How many of you are one bad season away from losing everything to him, same as her daddy did?" Hands went up, slow at first, then more, then most of the room. All those quiet, cornered people who'd been paying tribute to Roy Teller for years and never once said it out loud in front of each other. And now they were all looking at each other, and they were all seeing the same thing at the same time, that they were many and he was one. Teller looked around that chapel, and for the first time in 11 years, Roy Teller was afraid. He'd built his kingdom on people being alone with their debts, ashamed, isolated, each one thinking they were the only one. And a stranger had just stood them all up in the same room and turned the light on. He tried one more time. He put his hand on the gun at his hip. Just rested it there, a threat, the oldest threat there is. Ash moved before Deacon did. The wolf dog crossed the floor in 3 low strides and stopped 6 feet from Teller with her teeth bared and that sound coming up out of her chest that no man alive once pointed at him. And Deacon said, quiet, "I wouldn't. Not in front of all of them. Not over a woman who never wanted you." He held Teller's eyes. "Take the money, Roy. It's the best deal you're ever going to get, and we both know it." For a long moment nobody breathed. Then Teller took his hand off the gun. He snatched the envelope out of Deacon's hand, looked inside it, and whatever he saw there told him it was real. His jaw worked. His kingdom was gone, and he knew it. He shoved the foreclosure papers at Nora's mother, all of them, and said something ugly under his breath, and turned and walked down that aisle and out the door, past every face that had ever feared him, and not one of them looked away. His deputies looked at the room, looked at each other, and followed him out. But slower, like men deciding right then which side they wanted to be on when the dust settled. And then the chapel doors banged shut behind them, and it was just the valley in there. Just the people and the stranger and the bride. Nora turned to Deacon. There were 100 things in her face. She said, "You gave him everything. That was hers, wasn't it? Your wife's. You've kept it 10 years, and you just gave it to a man like that, for a woman you met an hour ago." Deacon looked at her a long time, and he said the truest thing he'd ever said. I kept it 10 years because I couldn't spend it on myself. It felt like spending her. He looked around the chapel, at the little girl he'd pulled from the flood now grown, at her mother alive in the front pew, at a whole valley of people breathing free for the first time. But this, she'd have wanted this. Ruth would have looked at all this and said, "That's what it was for, you old fool. That's exactly what it was for." His voice cracked. "I stopped on that bridge 10 years ago, and it cost me her last minute on this earth. And I've hated myself for it every day since. And now I know. Now I finally know what it bought. That was the payoff, and I'm not going to dress it up." The whole town saw a broken man set down a weight he'd carried for a decade. There wasn't a dry eye in that chapel. They didn't get married that day, of course. That part had been a lie, a beautiful, desperate lie told in a parking lot to buy a woman one more minute of freedom. And you might have wanted the story to end with the two of them saying vows right there, and I understand that, but that isn't how real things go, and this is a story about real things. Deacon Cade wasn't going to marry a woman he'd known an hour. He had too much respect for her and for Ruth and for the truth to do that. What he did do was stay. He got a room in Ellis Fork over the hardware store. He fixed his water pump, and he didn't ride back up into the mountains. Ash slept on the landing outside his door and watched the town like she'd appointed herself its keeper. And every few days Deacon would find some reason to be near the Whitfield place, mending a fence, hauling feed, saying little, the way quiet men do. He'd talk to Della for hours on the porch. And he'd talk to Nora, slow and careful, two people who'd been through fire learning what the other one sounded like on an ordinary day. The valley changed after that afternoon. Teller was gone by sundown, just like Deacon told him. It turned out a state examiner had been looking at that county's lending for a while, and once folks stopped being afraid, they had a great deal to say. The land Teller had taken over the years got tangled up in courts, and a lot of it found its way home. People started nodding at Deacon on the street. The waitress at the diner learned he took his coffee black and always saved a plate for the dog, and she talked to him, and he talked back, and every single time he did, it got a little easier. 10 years of silence, wearing away one word at a time. And Nora, well, Nora took her time and so did he, and that was right. But there's a thing that happens between two people who have stood at the bottom of the same flood, even 10 years apart. You don't have to explain the deep parts. They're already known. It was more than a year before they stood in that same little chapel again, and this time nobody had a badge and nobody had a debt, and there wasn't a lie anywhere in the building. Della cried in the front pew. Ash lay in the aisle with her chin on her paws. And when the preacher got to the part he'd never gotten to that first day, and told Deacon he could kiss the bride, the old road captain, gray and weathered and finally, fully home, leaned down and did. Somebody in the back, one of the old-timers who'd been there the first day, laughed and said out loud what everybody was thinking. He said, 10 years that man went without so much as talking to a woman. And look at him now. Deacon heard it. He didn't mind. He looked out at that room full of people he'd once been a stranger to, and down at the girl he'd pulled out of the water when she was 15, now his wife, and he thought about a rainy bridge, and a choice, and a debt paid across 10 long years in a currency he'd never understood until that afternoon. He'd stopped on that bridge and lost the world. And the world, patient and strange, had spent a decade finding its way back to hand him a new one. He hadn't seen a woman in 10 years, and then he saw this one, and he never looked away again. Tightened to roughly 4,995 words, within the 4,805-200 range. The hook is unchanged, 150 words. The ending is preserved verbatim, and every key beat remains: the parking lot rescue, the 10-year silence, Teller's debt trap, the marriage lie, the bridge revelation, the CTA after the payoff, the envelope, the town rising up, and the year-later wedding. The cuts came from redundant clauses and Teller's overlapping backstory, not story content.